one is an example of Singularity University. How many of you guys have heard of it? Okay. So Singularity University is focused on taking people who have already gone to school, so undergrads or grad students, and figure out how to teach them not backwards-looking information, like everything you should know in order for you to be smart, but forward-looking information, what's going to happen in the next 10 years. It was started by Ray Kurzweil with the idea of we can change the world if we actually prepare our people to go change the world. So when they started their institution, though, and they were thinking, how do we actually run an education institution, they were trying to figure out how not to do it as traditional systems. So I think they give us, just using their own intellectual model, how we might be able to think about organizational design. Most of their business, most of the people who actually deliver their institutional value do not actually work for them. And they deliver 300 hours of curriculum per student with 7 full-time staff. The 7 full-time staff basically are responsible for the mission and vision. They're responsible for the operating system, and they're responsible for making sure that they know who to recruit. That group recruits 10 what they call domain leaders, so the best people in medicine and bioscience, et cetera. And the very, very best people that they can find across the world, so they don't think about it also from a regional point of view, because they never actually need to interact with them physically. That group of 10 people brings in each 20 domain experts. 7, 10, 20. So that essentially 80% of the resources delivering the value of the organization is not in the center circle. Now, when I share this example to other organizations, they're like, I could never do that. And I just want to ask the question of, well, what would it take for us to think about that so that there's not an artifice between they work for us and we deliver to them, the customer, but we really try to think about how do we incorporate a bunch of people into how we create value. First example. Second example is one that you might know of a little bit more. So how many of you guys have gone to a TEDx event? Yeah, spoken perhaps. So TED, several years ago, was a venue where a couple thousand people were involved in a pretty small community, 2 conferences, a couple thousand people. And they decided they would start publishing their videos online, but then they went the next step further, which is to say people could also create their own event, and they licensed it with this idea of TEDx. You can do whatever, finish out the rest of the X, and it can be TEDx Canberra, TEDx New York, TEDx London, and in fact, since they launched that almost 3 years ago now, 3,000 events have happened with people figuring out what were the ideas close to them that mattered. Because, as you might imagine, someone sitting in the slums outside Nairobi are going to have a different set of local issues and ideas worth spreading than someone sitting in Long Beach, California, like Jeff Bezos, different set of issues going through their heads, right? And the thing that TED was able to do is to unite people through a shared purpose. It wasn't that the TEDxers were interested in supporting TED. There was some halo effect of brand, I'm sure, that they hoped for. But they were interested in figuring out what ideas matter to my community, and then how might I use this platform to share it really broadly. And TED got something in return. By using community instead of using their own dollars, they're able to create scale. The gorilla relied on scale all by themselves. Organizations today can actually figure out how to use scale with many people. This set of constructs, so I just walked through 2. I'm going to actually just walk through a couple more so that we can show that it actually applies to every part of the business. So we talked about employees being a traditional model. Social era, you would have curators or co-creation in terms of how you assemble a team. Service, how many of you know McAfee? So McAfee several years ago actually did a thing where they allowed what they called McAfee mavens, and those were self-designated terms, of people to actually provide service. So people who were essentially IT during the day could actually solve other customer problems. The same example was, Sandy just shared, that Apple customers can help each other out, right? So they actually figured out how to do pure communities. At the same time that McAfee was doing that, Symantec was spending, it ranged between 5 and 7% of their SG&A on service. So you have to think about the bottom line impact if you can take 5 to 7% of your SG&A and kind of reinvest it in other places. That's what they were able to do. Capitalization, you gotta have all heard of Kickstarter, right? That we can crowdfund anything. And I was just talking to someone yesterday, and she said she's going to have the entire business crowdfunded within a few weeks. You don't go to a bank anymore, right? The idea of venture capital is just so different. Angel investors is so different. Mass production, of course, has gone to custom production, and there's several examples. I use Desktop Factory, the 3D printing, where you can basically send anything, sprinkler head equipment to dolls. One of my favorite examples is Legos, where you can actually take a picture of your house and send it to them, and they send you back an entire Lego kit that's your house or your dog or your kid, or your own monster of your own creation. These are very addictive little things if you start to design them correctly. Distribution, you all know about Etsy, but we've seen that for several years, right? We've seen eBay and Amazon and other companies. But Etsy, Kitchit, which allows you to bring local caterers, sort of custom catering to your house. So instead of taking your friends out to a restaurant, you can bring it to your house and have more of a relationship experience. Supply chain, we just talked about Lego Factory. Evernote, how many of you guys have used Evernote? My gosh. And how many of you paid for Evernote? Okay, that's interesting. So the actual conversion rate is less than 5%, but they've managed to make an entirely viable business. And the CEO has been quoted with this notion of, if they love us, they'll pay for us. Right. So it's a really, really different thing. Before I've been in the software world for a long time, so I worked at Apple and other companies, and the idea was sort of, we got contracts and we bought shelf space and we did all these other things back then to figure out how to have market power. And today it's love. And love is such a different and interesting construct for how you even think about interacting with people. Because first you have to have a romance phase. And then you have to decide who's in charge and who's in charge of what. So there's a control and then there's a commitment phase and then a co-creation phase, right? Those are very different relationship arc than what we've used to do in the software world, which was to insist that our product be purchased and sort of buy ourselves into space. And I used to do quite a bit of work with Symantec, and they still use retail as a very, very big strategy. And then we talked about TEDx. Every part of the business can be social. Very few of the business models that we currently have in play actually leverage any of this. And the thesis, if before we were the 800-pound gorilla, where we won through overpowering domination over other people, the future is more like 800 gazelles. How do you get people who naturally want to do something to go out and do it? Voluntarily, doing human things a human wants to do. I love the stories we were hearing with the Bank of Scotland, because it was basically about how human beings actually want to do certain things, and if you let them, they will, like talk and work together. And of course, the social nature of what we're doing, we want to figure out how to help one another as service happens. We want to figure out how to help our friends grow businesses, so how crowdfunding happens, and so on. It allows many people to come together and create scale. Now, predicated behind that, why would we do any of that, has to have purpose. So a company that once purchased their way into power now needs to have a different set of alignment systems. So that why do the TEDx people do their thing? The shared purpose isn't the brand. The shared purpose is the goal, the social purpose. And just to kind of bring that home in terms of specifics, because purpose is one of those fuzzy little phrases in people's heads. And in fact, for as long as I've been talking about it, I find people usually nod their head and really get excited about purpose, but we're actually talking about entirely different things. So I just want to talk about an example. So in the U.S., and I'm sorry to use a U.S. example here, there's a store called Sports Authority, and Sports Authority has anything but Sports Authority people in it. That I might have to just give you the punchline, because they really are not people who practice sports, if you know what I mean. And but they happen to have a really strong retail footprint. Very similar to REI, which is a store that's kind of known for passionately figuring out how to get you more excited about sports. Whether or not you buy anything from them is sort of a secondary issue. They don't actually focus on the product. So the person who is showing you a backpack will then say, well, what are you backpacking for? And really do quite a bit of work to kind of understand who you are. Then we'll walk you over to the map section and show you exactly which map you need. And if they've actually gone camping, because like people who work there actually do this stuff, then they will say, oh, if you go to this lake, camp on this side. It's that level of passion that comes through. And the difference between the two is really Sports Authority is figuring out how to hire a cashier and an inventory person and someone who watches security and so on. And REI is figuring out how to hire people who passionately care about sports. And then customer service doesn't own the customer relationship, right? It's not some little department waved in the back. Everyone owns the customer relationship. And that's what Purpose does, because you can actually figure out not only how to align all your team, but you can figure out how to align people outside the perimeter of your organization, so that they have quite a few youth group kind of alliances, people who live in urban areas who may not actually ever see nature, and they'll figure out how to get those folks together, especially disadvantaged youth, and figure out how to get them to experience something bigger than themselves. And people will do that for free, because what they're most interested in is figuring out how to get people to love sports, not people to buy the product. And that's really the start of the exchange. That's what I mean by purpose, and that's why I want to share that story. So we need to figure out, how does this 800-pound gorilla stop thinking about how to just be, a little bit trimmer in order to get faster, but how do we actually get faster by being more nimble and become fast and fluid and flexible in how we work? Flexible meaning, how do we think about work as being freed from jobs? Fluid in terms of how we think about our mindset about, we don't need to know every answer. We need to figure out how to get a whole bunch of people in the room to know the big picture and then go out and do it. And fast, because we figure out how to have decisions at the nodes of the system, using a very technical term, rather than centralized within one part of the business. Back when I wrote book one of the stats I found was that most organizations across the world and across industries, only 5% of the team knew the strategy. 5%. So what are the other 95% people doing? They're being told what to do, effectively, right? If you don't know the big picture, then you have to kind of do this thing where you kind of wait. And that's largely what we've done in organizations. And that's exactly what social business hopes to transform. How do we get you to know it and own it in such a way that something can just become real? Southwest, which is again a U.S. airline, I apologize for the U.S. references there, had this phrase of, if everyone just knows what it is they need to do, they don't do it, you don't need to tell them. And that was what the organizing principle was of the organization. And I'm suggesting actually, this is what people want. It's what Daniel Pink was talking about when he said people wanted autonomy and purpose in their life. And if you could actually just tell them the big picture, they will actually apply their creative spirit into the work. And remember how I said most organizations are still limited in the frameworks of how they think about things. How do we make a lot of stuff? And how do we do it so that we're big enough to have power over others? And that was because profit was once a derivative of that size. So if I had more market power, then I had ability to buy the means of production, sort of make sure my supply chain was optimized, and I had access to marketing when small companies did not. Those two things have fundamentally been eliminated, and so size is no longer the same kind of asset that it once was. And I just want to help us think about what is the framework then that we might think about our business model. So I switched size to gorillas just so I can show you the comparable. That if one size was all by ourselves, scale was just by ourselves, we can also achieve scale with other people. And if it isn't just about making a whole bunch of stuff and shoving it out the door, then we can figure out also how do we create more meaning in the way in which we produce things. So kind of think about that axis as marketing, right? It's not just about how much stuff we can produce and how we shove it out the door, but how do we have more purpose? So big and scale, McDonald's still needs big and scale in terms of what they're doing. Chevron still needs to have multi-billion-dollar projects in order to be able to drill in the Arctic Sea. So that model's still going to exist. But I'm going to suggest some organizations that currently use the mentality of big and scale have other choices today. One is to think about how do we have more shared meaning with customers. So Zipcar might be a perfect example of that. Another could be thinking about how do we work in community with people. TED and TEDx would be another example of that. And then the final one, in terms of an axis, is how do we co-create with people? So, back when Michael Porter gave us the construct of the value chain, the actual language that was used in the 70s was buyer. Somewhere in the 80s, that person became a customer. Somewhere in the 90s, that person became a client. And right about now, we ought to be thinking about how do we co-create in every possible way. How do we figure out what customers want so that they're not just sitting at the outside? And I actually really have a problem with this notion of even thinking about an org structure as us and them. I'm trying to figure out how to just change even our taxonomy and vocabulary as a co-creative relationship. Because if we can figure out what to build with people, then the value proposition is quite different when people have co-created that with you. It's the 1,000 developers who stood up, who believed that thing that they had built was theirs. How are you going to associate a price tag with that? Right? It's really quite different. And of course, we talked about some of the examples, Zipcar, TEDx, and Kickstarter as some examples of organizations. What's interesting is when I did this once for banking, I shared this model with the banking industry, I showed them how Kiva came and went. How many of you guys know Kiva, just so I make sure? Okay. Kiva was a microfinancing organization that allowed many people to be able to give and then have that money come back through the financial system. PayPal was another example of allowing peer-to-peer transactions much easier. Square is the most recent example of that, where anyone can become a merchant. And I was talking to banking, and they all said, well, those are all just anomalies. So that's actually one thing about Sandy's work when she said banking was doing really progressive work. I was like, that's very interesting that it's showing up in the research. It's not showing up in my experience of banking. Because most of what they're doing is still thinking about how do we have scale and how do we get really big. It's why in the mindset they actually charge you fees to get back your own money. Right? If you use the ATM transaction, I'll charge you a $5 fee. You're like, it's my money. You're not even earning interest on that money anymore. I don't need a bank. I don't need a physical facility of a bank. What I need is my ability to get money back when I've put it in. And if we actually started a bank from scratch today, we wouldn't think of PayPal as an anomaly. Who would do that? So we just have to think about what are the constructs. Those might, if we had those other four constructs, or the other three, excuse me, we might start to think about, well, what's the business model that would optimize meaning? And what's the business model that would optimize communities? And really start to play with the variables more. And that's really what I want to suggest is the expanded frontier part of this. So that's the business model piece. I think there are more variables today than there have ever been about how do you work with others rather than over others. And the ramifications, the implications of what that looks like are still, like we're on the 1% scale of starting to see what that could look like. But I'm excited by the conversation that's happening even in the room today. Now let's talk about what does this mean for us as individuals. If I came into this room holding an idea like this, you might be able to see it, but only if you were sitting in the front row and you could kind of peek around the corners. But if I held an idea like this, you might be able to see it. You might be able to pick up the idea and make it yours. And surely we might be able to maybe massage that idea so it became bigger through our shared work. That central shift is what is also implied in social business in the social era. Whenever we sort of step into this world of social business, what we're actually talking about, this fundamental shift, is openness. How do we allow sharing? How do we allow collaboration? And then how do we distribute power to anyone, possibly even everyone? And I think that's the ethos of the world in which we're living in. But because many of us were sort of trained and educated and so on, certainly the leaders that we work with have been inculcated with this notion of more closed. I don't think we can necessarily see the shift, but it's the 20-somethings-year-olds that are sort of showing us that that's actually the ethos. Now, we see it in many places in the world today. We saw it in the Arab Spring, what openness looked like, where people actually allowed their own voices to overthrow oppressiveness. We see it in the TEDx example. We see it also in how any person, not pre-vetted, not pre-chosen, can collaborate. How many of you have heard of Fold It? It's a very scientific thing. So Fold It had a crowdsourcing kind of solution, a kind of game, if you want to make fun of games, a game where anyone could figure out how a protein would be folded. And the idea is if you could figure out how to map out that, it would allow scientific research to be accelerated. So the team opened it up with the idea that more professors would contribute, maybe more PhD people would contribute, and this process would become faster. When they looked back a year later and figured out who was the best protein folder in the world, any guesses? What gender? Woman. Was she a scientist? She was an admin. She was an admin who had always loved science. And in her night job that she gave herself, she figured out how to be the best protein folder in the world. And that's what I'm trying to point to when I say anyone, possibly even everyone. People that we wouldn't necessarily pick today can start to innovate with us. That's what openness allows. Now, some people say that openness is something that the young do, sort of it's a foolish, unaware, the naive do it, but when they know better, they won't. And of course, that's quite often how we have been trained, right? It's almost even the human condition. Because whenever we give birth to something, children, ideas, companies, we want to protect it. Maybe even save it from the harsh realities of the world. And maybe for children, maybe that's okay. But is it the right way to think about how we hold ideas and the way even how we think about how to work together? The industrial era rewarded this notion of if I had all the IP, then I will have power. Because the one who had the machine was the one who made money 50 years ago. And today that's no longer the same system of power. I would argue that's at multiple levels, right? Institutionally, you don't need the machine in order to have power. Societally, it's not necessarily clear that the people who are in power in those oppressive governments will stay in power because people have much more voice. And of course, individually. Because the key is when a whole bunch of people can do the work, you start to actually create speed and velocity, and more importantly, ownership. Now, some people say this letting go thing is just way too hard, and surely we'll be vulnerable in the process. And I think the key is actually this. Is to think about how do we be open. It's not that everything will be open, but to think about what could be. And for those people who don't believe this argument that openness is key, I want to walk through a mobile example as a way of thinking about market power. Android, in 4 years, has captured 50% of the market share by an entirely open strategy. And Apple, which once didn't release its SDK and never wanted to partner with anyone, figured out also how to do open. I was running the stats yesterday, and it was $1.9 billion of their revenue stream is from the App Store. And that's a gargantuan number, right? It's only 6% of their revenues for the last quarter. But what I think is, I think you guys would agree, there's no way that platform would be as strong if you didn't have all the developers and community participating in that. And Google didn't do everything open, and Apple didn't do everything open. So it's not that we're saying that, gosh, we're talking about free. That's not what we're saying. We're trying to figure out what part of it can be open in order for value to be created. For ourselves too, right? What part of what we need to share can be open? And the other big shift that happened in the last 4 years is how much there's now a wider distribution stream. So revenues used to only flow to a small set of operators. It's now flowing to a much wider group of developers. And of course, that creates an interesting competitive moat, right? When a whole bunch of developers are starting to participate in your platform, they built a moat around that platform. They're not going to abandon it. They abandoned Nokia pretty fast. They abandoned RIM pretty fast, but they haven't abandoned Apple because of what they're allowed to create. Now, you can't measure openness on its own. You can't sort of say, gosh, $1.9 billion, only 6% of the revenue. Because what I just pointed to, that developer competitive mode, is actually something that you get as a secondary effect. Just like riding a bicycle trains you sort of physically to do more than ride the bicycle, openness actually creates something that you can't always see and prepares you for something else. App Store, we saw that example. I want to do one more. Patients Like Me. Anybody heard of that one? Okay, a few more people. So Patients Like Me started with 3 guys at MIT, one of whom's brother had Lou Gehrig's disease. And as they started to do a bunch of research to figure out how to basically address the issues, they realized very little information was widely available. And so they started a site with the idea of sharing what it was that was going on to see if other people were having similar situations. And since then, you can actually find many key diseases where people will actually share, here's the treatment I'm on, here's the side effects I'm having, here's where I am in the phase, here's what my doctor is telling me, and actually starting to share that so you can now start to do research at a very different level. Most healthcare information has been viewed as stuff we should hold like this. And Patients Like Me is saying, actually, we can find better solutions, faster solutions, and do even something, maybe even save someone's life, and save the healthcare system if we do this. Openness. So I wasn't always a believer in openness. I actually worked at and ran a big division of this company called Autodesk. And back then, I was in my late 20s. It's a very embarrassing story. I was hired to run this relatively big division, and I was really young, really young, relatively speaking. But because I'd been given this big job, I thought it was pretty hot shit. And I more importantly wanted to believe I was really hot shit, right? And we were preparing something for the board, and somebody on the team didn't agree with the direction that I wanted and wouldn't sort of capitulate to my point of view. And because I did what a lot of know-it-all kind of people do, I really wanted to win the argument. I really wanted to be right. And I couldn't convince privately, so then it went into the hallways until I ultimately did what I call, a corporate takedown, sort of that stick your foot out moment and watch someone trip. I kind of did the verbal equivalent of that in a major meeting. I sort of won the argument. So the board approved the plan. We ended up getting quite a lot of accolades for the sort of success of that particular thing and grew the revenues quite a bit. But the CEO brought me in to have a conversation and said, the team doesn't actually trust you anymore. Because the person I had taken down, by the way, was a really good friend. She had run a marathon with me, so that by me is, gosh, I look young, and different hair. But I had taken down this person because I wanted so much to be right, and that was really the architecture that was in my head. And now I've come to believe something quite different now with 10 plus years of helping companies actually do innovation. And what I realized is it's never just about the idea. That's necessary, but not sufficient. It's always about how people engage that idea. So that if it's held like this, it can never be held by many. But if it's held like this, it can be. And so I've come to realize that the future's not created, the future's co-created. And that in the way in which we engage ideas and one another is actually how we go about creating real change in the world. Openness allows us to do more than share and collaborate and distribute power. It allows us to co-create and create communities and invent solutions that we can't see all by ourselves. And in fact, I think the mythology and the dream is that if we hold things really tightly, we might get a diamond if we just do it with enough pressure. But the idea is we might be able to unlock a lot of potential that we can't see today if we choose openness as our path. So that's what I wanted to say. Thank you.